To Sherlock Holmes, she is always the woman. I have seldom heard him mention her under any other name. In his eyes, she eclipses and predominates the whole of her sex. Hello everybody, I'm KC and welcome to another edition of Let's Talk About, and welcome to the latest installment of Sherlock and the Curious Critic. And after far too long a wait, it's time to return to the streets of London with the great detective and the good doctor in the Sherlock Season 2 premiere, A Scandal in Belgravia. But first, some unresolved business. I want to say that after almost 2 years of waiting, since this time around I think I had to wait for the US releases, the fact that this chilling cliffhanger was wrapped up with Moriarty getting a phone call and walking off was a real underwhelming payoff, but I also thought it was kind of funny. It was exasperating and amusing all at the same time, but at least nobody blew up. But it wasn't a one-off joke, because that phone call was from a person of interest that leads us to the main story. Sherlock and John are back to work at Baker Street and are hired by an illustrious client to retrieve sensitive information. A confrontation that leads Sherlock on an unusual journey with a woman unlike any other he's known. The woman, in fact, Irene Adler. Alright, now that the introductions are out of the way, Season 2 of Sherlock will not only be bigger in scale, but the stories are updating from much more well-known areas of the Holmes canon. The most well-known, in fact. And first up is Irene Adler, played here by Laura Pulver. Despite only appearing in one story and barely referenced after that, Irene has become much more important to Sherlock Holmes as a character over the years because she was the only adversary in one of the main stories to outsmart Sherlock. And even out of story, that list isn't that long. Because this is such an intimate topic in the Holmes canon, and how it's portrayed in this episode is on a much more personal level that envelops the events throughout, it's going to be tougher to compartmentalize events and parts of the production, but I will try my best. We'll go more into Irene's connection to Sherlock later on, but right now let's talk about her and her presentation here. I do remember that there was some controversy among fans of the original story that Irene was turned into a dominatrix here, and I totally get that because I didn't love the change at first either. Turning the most important female character in the Holmes universe into a glorified woman for hire, which she was never implied to be in the original text. But revisiting this episode and the story over the years, it's not that much of a stretch. Why did Holmes seek out Irene in A Scandal in Bohemia? Because she had an affair with royalty and had a photograph proving that. And that's more or less her role in the first half hour of this episode. Looking at the main reason why they crossed paths to begin with in A Scandal in Bohemia, it's not that far of a leap to take, especially since what qualifies as scandalous in Victorian times is much more mild by today's standards. So I get that they needed to up the compromising nature of the photo Irene had this time around. I'm not saying it's the best idea, but it does have evidence to ground its interpretation. But Irene doesn't just have compromising information on one individual, she gathers sensitive information through her escapades to protect herself from consequence. Since that's the only major obstacle Irene presents in the original story, they expanded on that to fit the more demanding needs of a Sherlock story. And having reread A Scandal in Bohemia for the purpose of this review, it's a fine update. I am surprised they didn't find a way to include Irene being a singer though. There could have been a fun scene to be had there. Although I do have one major problem with this update. Why is she British? No disrespect to Laura Pulver, she's magnificent here, but Irene was from New Jersey.
You belong in New Jersey!
A good chunk of A Scandal in Belgravia is a pretty respectful recreation of A Scandal in Bohemia, or at least the most memorable bits from it. Sherlock is called upon by royalty, which isn't as unusual as you'd think, to retrieve a photo from Irene. Sherlock disguises himself as a vicar who was attacked to get into her house, and uses a false fire alarm to get Irene to reveal the location of her most precious asset, the information he's looking for. It's pretty fun to watch these events play out differently, but in a way that still feels faithful to this beloved story. But there are of course other references to those original stories in this episode, so it's once again time for... While most of A Scandal in Belgravia is dedicated to referencing and expanding on the foundation of A Scandal in Bohemia, there are a few more references to other stories. Mycroft's associate at Buckingham Palace calls their client illustrious, an obvious reference to the story The Illustrious Client, where Holmes was asked to take on a case on behalf of a client who preferred to remain anonymous, though the end of the story hints that it was the reigning king of England at the time. Sherlock even partly quotes the story with his initial refusal to take the case.
Mycroft, I don't do anonymous clients. I'm used to mystery at one end of my cases. Both ends is too much work.
While we saw and heard about Sherlock's violin in the first season, this is the first time we see him play it properly and even compose. And there's one more jab at John's appeal for the opposite sex, derived from a now infamous line from The Sign of Four, in an experience of women which extends over many nations and 3 separate continents. I recently found out this led to the fandom dubbing John 3 Continents Watson. For a good background one, in Sherlock's room, there's a poster on the wall with instructions for Baritsu in Japanese characters, a Japanese form of wrestling Sherlock said he trained in The Empty House. And I am sure there are other background details like that in this room, but none of the shots really give a good look. I only got that one through the commentary track. The rest of the notable references are mostly crammed into the delightful opening montage, chronicling months of cases Sherlock and John have been on as John writes about them on his blog, with titles that are all a play on Sherlock Holmes stories. The geek interpreter was the Greek interpreter, the speckled blonde was the speckled band, and the naval treatment is a play on the naval treaty. There's also a reference to the story of the aluminium crutch. While not a full Sherlock Holmes story, that case was referenced in passing in the Musgrave Ritual. Those plays on classic titles could have just been fun throwaway lines, but in a great move to expand with supplementary material, all of these cases were written up on an official website meant to resemble John's blog. It's still up online at the time of making this video, so if you want a little bit of fun extra content, it's certainly worth a read. This montage also mentions that Sherlock has categorized 240 types of tobacco ash, something that was mentioned in The Sign of Four, except there it was 140. And part of me feels weird putting this in the Let From the Pages segment, but I gotta. The hat. They found a way to get Sherlock to wear the hat. The Deerstalker hat has a long, complicated history of how it became so tied to Sherlock Holmes, but there's a lot to talk about with this episode that there just isn't time for me to go into that here. Maybe in a future installment, but not now. I have seen some people read the popularity of John's blog as Moffat and Gatiss poking fun at their own almost overnight success with Sherlock, and that could be part of it, but honestly, massive fan adoration of Sherlock Holmes has been a thing since the original stories. In fact, the fan base that developed around Sherlock Holmes during his literature days was, and still is so dedicated, it's often claimed as the origin of what we now refer to as fandom. The last 10 years of adaptations has more or less been a resurgence of sorts of that original love and dedication from readers. Really, the most unrealistic thing about Sherlock is that John never tries to capitalize on his blog's popularity. This story, where my friend and I ran after murderers, is brought to you by Audible. This montage is not only packed to the brim with book-related references, but shows how much the production value has evolved, with things like John's blog as he's typing floating on screen like they're text, and transitions like Sherlock pacing across a room to swipe in between clients. The production design of Sherlock was always creative and worthy of praise, but now that it's round 2, the crew are cranking things up a few more levels to deliver a truly memorable experience visually. The composition of the shots are stunning and eye-catching in an almost artistic way. Moments of presenting how Sherlock thinks to the audience continues to convey just that, not only with showing how he focuses and comes to conclusions, but there's a great moment where the world slows down around Sherlock while he's working on a mystery, showing how quickly he can think and conclude compared to everything around him. The standout, though, is the scenes of working through a throwaway case in the episode The Mysterious Death of a Hiker, placing Sherlock and Irene right into the middle of the crime scene, furniture and all. Watching the events play out as they observe like the spirits in A Christmas Carol is remarkable in its presentation and leaves a distinct impression on the scene. Oh, also, turns out this guy was killed by a boomerang. That's so out there, but so creative. I love it. But there's more than just the amazing production work going on in this scene. These sequences of working out the hiker's death are sandwiched between Sherlock and Irene's first encounter, where we see how she's a different adversary from what Sherlock faced in the past, in more ways than one. Yeah, I think this is the scene people point to the most when they mention having problems problems with Irene's change in character. But let's ignore Irene's form for a second. I know it's hard, but let's try, and dissect what's actually going on in this scene and why she's taking this approach. An approach that's probably one of many methods Irene uses to take command of a situation, to be in control of it, because everyone would have a caught off guard reaction to this kind of entrance. You see that the most with John. But then there's Sherlock, who is also unnerved by Irene's body, but not for the reasons most would be, but because he can't deduce anything from her like that. This is even foreshadowed well with a few instances of Sherlock deducing much from a person by their clothes. That said, I probably could have lived without it myself. I give them credit for having a purpose for going for nudity, but that doesn't mean I have to be a huge fan of it. Thankfully though, this only lasts a couple of minutes, and we see that Irene doesn't need cheap tricks like that to be clever. It's just a tool in her kit that for many works. The whole scene is basically the two of them subtly fighting to gain the upper hand in this confrontation for information, to the point where John starts to feel like a third wheel in a way that really helps tie the scene together.
I had a tea too in the palace, if anyone's interested.
You gotta love that Freeman dry delivery. When they more or less reenact A Scandal in Bohemia, it's essentially mental tennis, where in the end, Irene makes the final move, keeping intact the most important thing about Irene, that she beat Sherlock Holmes. But we're not even halfway through, so the question remains, what do we do with the rest of the episode? Expand and explore this relationship, of course. So, let's go ahead and talk about Sherlock Holmes' relationship with women. If I had a bigger audience, I'd be mourning the comment section. In the original stories, Holmes had a low opinion of the opposite sex. He didn't trust them and didn't believe them capable of the cold, calculated logic he held above all else. Oh, he was kind of respectful towards most, he just didn't have a high regard for the whole of the gender. That's why Irene is so significant for Sherlock Holmes and his fans, because she was the only woman to challenge that belief. That's why Holmes calls her the woman. Irene was an adversary that left an impression on him. He held her to a level of respect unmatched by any other woman in Holmes' lifetime. But here's the issue. That well-known low opinion of women isn't really a thing in Sherlock, which was definitely a good call. Oh, he's hardly a prince and has insulted members of the opposite sex across the series, but no more so than he does anyone else. Say what you want about him, but Sherlock's insulting and condescending nature is equal to all. Actually, this episode seems to have moments exploring Sherlock's connection not just to Irene, but to all the important women in his life. During a Christmas party, he makes fun of Molly when he deduces she's giving someone she likes a gift, but apologizes when he realizes that it's for him and he hurt her feelings with his actions. Which is the first time he really shows any feeling of compassion towards Molly. Him and John call out Mycroft when he's rude to Mrs. Hudson, and in quite possibly the best scene in the episode, he defends Mrs. Hudson when she's attacked by recurring CIA agents. As soon as the pieces are put together about what happened to her, you can tell that someone's gonna pay for that. It's a great section because it shows Mrs. Hudson's clever side, having what they were looking for the whole time, but keeping it hidden, and once again showing just how much the boys, especially Sherlock, care about her. To the point that the agent that did this to her is dropped out of a window multiple times.
If Mrs. Hudson leave Baker Street, England would fall.
So if this version of Sherlock doesn't have a distaste for the opposite sex, how do you make one stand out among the rest? Well, when he starts to fixate on Irene after their confrontation, she starts texting him regularly, but he never replies, and at one point she's even believed to be dead and Sherlock seems to mourn her, John starts to wonder if Sherlock feels something more towards this woman. This is really common in adaptations involving Irene, because obviously, if a man thinks highly of a woman, it must be love. Love that is in no way conveyed in the original text, sub or otherwise. In fact, it seems to go out of its way to dismiss that notion entirely. But that doesn't stop several writers from interpreting that from Irene's legacy as being the woman to Sherlock Holmes. And Sherlock certainly toys with the idea. Season 2 as a whole starts to dig into and challenge Sherlock as a character much deeper than the first, each episode taking on a different emotional emotional conflict for him. The first, obviously, is Sherlock and love. You'll also notice that the man Irene married in the original story is suspiciously missing from this and most adaptations. But even though A Scandal in Belgravia teases the notion that Sherlock might be in love with Irene, it never cashes the check, so to speak. While there have been adaptations that have ran with the idea that Holmes felt something deeper for Irene, the way Sherlock approaches this concept is more from the outside looking in. Why is Sherlock so fixated on this woman? Maybe because he likes her? John teases him about it on multiple occasions. But Sherlock himself never really entertains that idea because that's not the kind of character he is. This might be my own asexual bias talking, but I'm not really a fan of Sherlock being romantically involved, especially when going back to the original stories. Women have seldom been an attraction to me, for my brain has always governed my heart. Like, it's fine if you want your John Locke fanfics, that's not a thing that started with the show either, but I prefer the idea that Sherlock isn't into anything. A lot of this episode is showing how Sherlock feels towards others, just how removed he can be by being rude and blunt and dismissing others' opinions and feelings. Heck, one of the most well-remembered gags in this episode is that Sherlock cares so little about accommodating for other people that he's escorted to Buckingham Palace wearing nothing but a sheet, but cares enough to not walk out without it. But there are definitely moments of him examining his actions towards the people in his life, and there's a small but important moment after Irene is presumed dead, where he ponders with Mycroft if there's something wrong with how they choose to uphold logic and reason over sentiment.
They all care so much. Do you ever wonder if there's something wrong with us?
Where Mycroft sees getting involved, as he calls it, a hindrance rather than a benefit, Sherlock contemplates the feelings he's worked to remove himself from, because despite what everyone else thinks, he still has them. I'm not saying Sherlock Holmes should be the poster boy for how to portray asexual individuals, but I'm not saying it's a bad portrayal either, because Sherlock does care about people, no matter how much he claims to the contrary. Not in that intimate way that's associated with sexual attraction, but in a way that once a personal connection is made, he will value it more than he'll ever admit. His friendship with John is the shining example of this. They've definitely reached the inseparable iconic duo level for season 2. Having codes for what actions to take during cases, joking around together, John being there for him on a more personal level as the events with Irene play out, even trying to protect him again by demanding that Irene tell him she's alive, and just becoming more compatible as a team and friends. But they still have their disagreements, of course, and John's desire to punch Sherlock is apparently quite high. But the story kind of keeps you guessing about what Sherlock's feelings are towards Irene and vice versa, as he's clearly processing a lot about this woman, maybe even in ways he doesn't fully understand. But they all revolve around one thing, and it's the same form of flattery as in the original story. Sherlock admires Irene not romantically, but on the highest level for him and one of the few he's capable of, intellectually.
Why?
Because you cater to the whims of the pathetic and take your clothes off to make an impression. Stop boring me and think. It's the new sexy.
He sees that she's clever and a challenge of sorts. Maybe it's some sort of obsession to be the one to come out on top in this whole thing. Maybe he's fascinated with someone who was capable of beating him. Or maybe he wants to be the hero and show off when she comes to them for help. It's never made quite clear. But no matter what, Irene always manages to come out on top. There are one or two instances where she falls for one of Sherlock's tricks, but she either has a quick out or sees through it and plays along until she gets ahead. Once again, it's a game to them. A game they seem to enjoy. Cumberbatch and Pulliver also work excellently together, so watching them mentally duel, as it were, had me completely invested. But this game of theirs officially comes to a head with Sherlock officially being played. For it turns out Irene used him to decrypt information she had obtained that would sabotage a mission the US and British governments had to fake a successful terrorist attack where no one would be hurt. It's a chilling scene, not just because of this haunting location of a plane filled with corpses, but the revelation that for a while it seems like Sherlock has truly lost.
Word to the wise, my dear. Never fall in love with a woman who sells herself. It always ends badly.
But apparently, as clever as Irene is, she didn't do this alone.
Jim Moriarty sends his love.
I know this is something else that bothers a lot of people. It bothers me more that this is a trend in adaptations lately, that Irene works for Moriarty, but in this case, Irene already had the pieces. Moriarty just led her in the right direction to use it to her benefit. Being the consulting criminal he is, after all, Irene was looking for the best way for her to gain something from this information without her coming off as just a stooge for the bigger antagonist. So I think it works in this case. I think I also remember people having a problem with the fact that Sherlock managed to win in the end, since, as I've said, the most memorable thing about Irene is that she managed to beat Sherlock in the end. And I get that, but keep in mind, Irene has won and played Sherlock time and time again throughout this episode. This wasn't him putting on a long act from the very beginning to get to this point. They're on equal ground the entire time, and in every encounter, Irene had managed to best him. He played into her plan to sabotage this massive government mission to the point that she would have had said government in the palm of her hand. The only reason he comes out on top is because he finally managed to get what he had been seeking since the beginning. Her only leverage, the key to her heart. That amazing reveal of the passcode has become one of the most iconic images of the series. You can get it printed on almost anything. This revelation is both triumphant and heartbreaking when all is said and done. It's tragic because the resolution of this case seems to portray Sherlock as the cold, calculating machine everyone thinks he is, using love and sentiment as nothing more than a piece of evidence, a play in the game, the weak point that ultimately did Irene in. But like most things with Sherlock Holmes, it's not that simple. For one, during a talk with John, Mycroft poses the question of why Sherlock chooses to use his great intellect to be a detective of all things, which, God, that is the most important question concerning Sherlock in the series, and there's so much I can say on it, but again, now's not the time. So I'm gonna ask you to remember this moment just like the one I mentioned in The Great Game. I promise this is going somewhere, just not for a while. Despite Irene deceiving him so much and what Sherlock did to her by taking away her secure information, the epilogue contemplates how he truly feels about her after everything. Well, the show sort of tells us, while Moffat slides in a Doctor Who callback because fanboys just can't help themselves sometimes.
When I say run, run. When I say run, run.
In the end, Sherlock went out of his way to save Irene after everything she did, doesn't tell a soul, not even John, who was told she was dead, a death that we can assume Sherlock helped her fake, and locks Irene's phone away in his drawer, much like that photo his literary counterpart did over a century prior. Even if Sherlock can put caring aside for the sake of a case, saying he doesn't care about anything or anyone is looking at the forest through the trees. It's more complicated than that, maybe even more than he realized, especially with someone like Irene. I get the feeling that whether or not it was love, whether or not they ever see each other again, whenever Sherlock Holmes thinks of Irene Adler, it'll be under the admirable title of
The Woman.
Overall, A Scandal in Belgravia is a much more personal story than we've seen in Sherlock up to this point, but it's a fascinating look at this iconic confrontation between these two very clever people and their very complicated relationship. While I know there are people who aren't fond of this episode because it plays into this fanon myth that Irene could have felt something more for Sherlock beyond this one incident, to many others it's regarded as one of the best episodes of the series. And coming back to this episode for the sake of analysis, I'm more inclined towards the latter. That wasn't always how I felt, mind you. I used to have more issues with this episode. But looking back on it over the years, I think A Scandal in Belgravia takes a very interesting look at not just these two characters, but the legacy that's developed between them over the course of fan interpretation, updating the story in an interesting way that doesn't fully commit to the idea that there was a deep romance between them, but explores it for deeper meaning to challenge the characters. The cast continues to deliver exceptional work, the dialogue is still fun and snappy, the production is even more impressive for this comeback season, and the ways they expand on the framework given them in A Scandal in Bohemia into a narrative that would not only fit the demands of the series, but also help explore what they already established about their own universe deeper, is really all I can ask for from an episode of Sherlock. If nothing else, it showed that Sherlock still had the same level of intrigue to offer for its second season, and that they were going to go deep into the most popular areas of the Holmes universe. And we'll see see perhaps the biggest test of that with The Hounds of Baskerville. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.